Hello, welcome to Occupy 2. I am Irene. I'm an artist and I'm the initiator of Occupy 2, which is an art research program. It's conducted with the support of French Institut Greece. Occupy 1 started in New York last February. It was a collaboration between artists, the Greek Consulate General in New York, and the cultural services of the French Embassy in the United States as a form of residency, research, experiment within the consulate's building, echoing the occupations of schools that we had during my childhood and I guess Sozita's childhood in Greece in the 90s. The objectives of Occupy and of this research group are to structure or to highlight dialogue within the art community, to maintain movement in creativity while identifying initiatives during these difficult months, and to break isolation for artists who face the adversities. Our discussion today is Unoccupied on Collective Authorship, Institutions and Care, and is moderated by Dr. Sozita Goudouna. Dr. Sozita Goudouna is a professor, she's a curator, and she's one of our dear counselors on Occupy 2. She's head of operations at Raymond Petitbon Studio and visiting professor at City University of New York and at New York University. She's the founding director of the US nonprofit Greece in USA for the promotion of contemporary Greek art. Okay, her curriculum is endless and I couldn't share all her amazing experiences here, but above all, I know her and I know her to be an exceptional human being with a big heart, and I can always count on her. Thank you, Sozita, for doing this with us. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and I will let Sozita introduce everyone.
Thank you, Irene, for inviting me to participate in this collaborative project that we all know the difficulties that such a project entails, and it has been a great process all along. This is the reason that I decided to focus on collaborative authorship. Obviously, since we are co-writing this project, all of us, the artists, the curators and hierarchies are shifting into something like an ensemble, like a dramaturgy, which is not often the case in the visual arts. The visual arts sometimes are focusing on a solo artistic practice. And we have invited today the Care Collective, a collective that responds to the crisis of care. And it was formed in 2017, predicting perhaps the requirements, the current requirements with COVID. It's a London-based reading group aiming to understand and address the multiple and extreme crises of care. It's coming from a different discipline. They have been active both collectively and individually in diverse personal, academic and political contexts, and the members include Andreas Chatzidakis, Jamie Hakim, Joel Littler, Catherine Rottenberg and Lynne Segal. Two members are here and will present to us the way they co-authored this book. The inspiration behind this panel is also a book that I'm co-writing with Minnesota University, for Minnesota University Press, with a group of academics that we would present at the conference, the Performance Studies Conference in Rijeka, Croatia. And we are all writing together from different parts of the world, and I found many parallels with our project. Eero, Laine will present later our parts of this research. Vill Balaskas is also the next presenter, but we can start with the Care Collective. Andreas and Lynne will present the Manifesto of Care.
Straight to me then, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting us here and for that warm introduction. It is really wonderful to be on this exciting global platform in Athens, though I do wish I could be there in person. But as you've said, where words meet and Zooms mingle is always also a good place to be.
I'm in New York and in And Vill is in London.
That's wonderful.
Vassilis in France.
So we're together then, sharing our words and trying to mingle in this time of calamity, really, crisis, wherever we look. But as we surely know, we didn't just predict this crisis of care and these calamities. We really were already in them long ago. I mean, first of all, this pandemic was predicted and our governments did nothing to prepare for them. But also we were facing a care crisis everywhere. And that's why we began our reading group 3 years ago, and why then we decided to publish our manifesto, which I meant to hold up, but I'll hold up later unless Andreas can, called, that's it, the right way round, the Care Manifesto, the Politics of Interdependence, and the subtitle is crucial, the Politics of Interdependence. So then we began meeting precisely because there was already a crisis of care long before the pandemic. So we know this was true both nationally and internationally, that we had been facing a situation in which so many of our caring needs were not being met. Now, we're not the first to say this. Nancy Fraser, Joan Tronto, and many others have been saying it for years. And we agree with Fraser in seeing the issue of care, who cares, who has time to care, as the key contradiction of contemporary capitalism, which leaves no place to care, or in the Marxist vernacular, no place for social reproduction in the relentless, the ruthless motors of production. And so our manifesto begins by talking about this widespread lack of care, what we describe indeed as a deliberate politics of carelessness at every level and engulfing the world, also evident in rising inequality far and wide, always inflected by racism and legacies of colonialism. We see it in endless war, in the overwhelming refugee crisis, the Mediterranean being carpeted with the swollen bodies of men, women, and children seeking some asylum, as those in Greece know only too well, plus a general rise of populist, authoritarian, and reactionary governments. And meanwhile, of course, looming over everything, ongoing climate change and imminent environmental catastrophe. None of this is new. None of this emerges simply in 2020. And yet, despite so much gloom, what we're also writing about in the manifesto is what our world could look like if we were to put care front and center of our politics. That is, if we were to begin from a recognition of our shared vulnerabilities and our global interdependencies. If 2020 has taught us anything, surely it has taught us this. And yet still right now, we're very far from people overall sharing that vision. So let me begin first by addressing that problem. It's a problem of place where feminists often began the fact that care has almost always been overvalued. Sorry, care has always been undervalued. How could I do that? Care has always been undervalued, both historically and still today. And it's not the first time that there's been calls, like the call we make, to embed care at the heart of politics. Feminists have long made this call, right from the very beginning of the late 60s, the 1970s, best known in the voices of Adrian Rich and Gilligan and Ruddick and Kitai and so many others. But there's our first problem, that care is seen as the work of women, as what women do, as women's sphere, which traditionally always went unpaid and was barely seen as work at all, routinely marginalized as unproductive. Even on the left, real politics has prioritized jobs and the economy, somehow not noticing the caring jobs. Yet we know, feminists know, that the economy completely relies upon the work of care, of social reproduction, of all that enables people to survive, thrive, and reproduce themselves, or there would be no economy at all. Instead, however, we still see governments trying to control women's bodies, and this is almost always the first move of authoritarian right-wing governments, as today in India, Poland, Hungary, Turkey. It's also, of course, what Trump tried so hard to do worldwide, refusing funding for abortion rights or even for contraception in giving money to other poorer countries. So caring has always been gendered, but in today's long hours, paid working lives, neither women nor men have much time for it. And that has resulted in the huge care deficit that we know today, particularly in richer countries, which has generated a global care chain, a chain of predominantly poor, immigrant and non-white women. Thus, racism now combines, as indeed it's always combined, but even more strongly with gender and global inequality to devalue caring work further. As well, care has always been undervalued and indeed often repudiated because of widespread contempt and devaluation for so-called dependency. Symbolic manhood has always been seen as the very antithesis of dependency. Now, you'd think that this old gender cliche might have disappeared long ago, but for the last 4 decades, neoliberal exaltation of wholly misleading notions of individual resilience, autonomy, and choice has actually deepened the disavowal of human fragility, dependence, and need for care. So the ideal citizen today, male or female, has to be entrepreneurial, resilient, and self-sufficient. Indeed, the pathologizing of dependency helped to justify the dismantling of welfare cuts begun in the UK under Margaret Thatcher, begun around the world, but ramped up under neoliberal regimes. And yet, another reason for marginalizing care is that it can be very challenging work. Indeed, the concept care overflows itself with paradoxes and, above all, ambivalences, often generating conflicting emotions, feelings rarely given due respect or attention. For attending fully to the needs of any living thing usually means confronting vulnerability, confronting fragility, and it can be troubling and exhausting work. Hands-on caring brings us into contact with our own and others' mortal embodied selves. So this is also why it's been traditionally relegated to the domain of women or servants, deemed inferior just because this is the work, the crucial work that they do, and thereby enabling others to disavow thoughts of their own inescapable vulnerability and inevitable mortality. And this takes us back also to neoliberalism and the marketing and outsourcing of public provision, which Andreas will say more about. Public care provision has become increasingly inaccessible for so many around the globe, with services outsourced to corporate commodity chains. Privatized care often creates intolerable conditions for their workers in insecure, underpaid, 0 hours contracts. I'm sure you're all well aware of this, curtailing the continuity of jobs or caring. So while massive profits have been made from outsourced care, one of the main sources of profits today, the resulting provision often mocks the very name of care, with little security for either those being cared for or, of course, for the carers. Neglect by design is how this is best described. And further, the challenges of care and anxieties over doing it well or even adequately can easily fuel resentment in caring relationships. Thus, both positive and negative emotions easily intertwine with our capacities to care, which we need to understand, especially when care is so undervalued. And this is precisely what these complexities and challenges of care mean, is precisely why we need to fight to ensure all the necessary social infrastructures that can assist us in caring for others, whether near or far. Pressures of today's job market mean we barely have time to care for ourselves or those who most depend upon us, let alone pay attention to the needs of others. So more time, more material resources are always essential to facilitate mutually fulfilling and imaginative practices of care, not just at a national, but at global levels. However, in the manifesto, we do also look into something you'll all be interested in, different times and places where we've seen alternative models of care, contrasting that with that of overburdened mothers and other existing carers. So we noted, for instance, the alternative care practices occurring in the peak years of AIDS activism from the 1980s, when neither states, and often not families either, were taking adequate care of people with that virus. Feminists, of course, also experimented with many alternative forms of care during the 1970s and sometimes beyond. And of course, we saw similar caring practices during the high points of occupied protests, with collective kitchens, healthcare, and more. Again, I know you can add to all of this. So in the manifesto, we call for these sorts of multiplication of and experimentation with forms of care, which we call promiscuous care, taking us well beyond what is often the shriveled forms of care available today. Promiscuous not in the sense that it doesn't last long and we go from one person we might care for to another, but in terms of knowing that we can all care for everybody. We can all try and be engaged in care. And it's in this way then that we want to help proliferate and expand our circles of care, which is all so crucial, especially when we think about the mounting refugee crisis, the environmental crisis. It means reimagining the stranger and the non-human world as akin to our closest world, not making all those borders and divisions. So advocating for an ethics of promiscuous care is thus our first step in building the psychic and social infrastructures of a society that has universal care at its heart. But of course, remember, I'm also saying that adequate care needs those basic social infrastructures to enable us to be able to care properly. So again, any sustainable future means fully recognizing that we are all formed in different ways in and through those interdependencies. But some people, always inflected by class, race, and legacies of colonialism,
I kind of first came across it by...
are today rendered so much more vulnerable than others. The truth is, we all need others from cradle to grave to care for us. And it's from cradle to grave that more and more people are not getting the care they need. But that adequate care can only exist, only be provided in caring communities with solid infrastructures that all can rely upon. Moreover, our caring communities must be part of a caring and sustainable world. We surely know that now. if we're not to give ground also to the right, who always rely upon demonizing all those they see as more vulnerable, as more needy than they imagine themselves to be, usually quite wrongly, because their caring needs are simply being met. But especially, they like to ignore those globally who are not only impoverished, but whom wealthier nations have almost always helped to impoverish. So to conclude then, we all need both to give and to receive care, to sustain any sense of our common humanity. And only in this way can we confront our own shared fears of human frailty, rather than project them out onto those we label as more needy than us, because doing that is the very seedbed for the right as they set out to divide and rule. So time for change and time to hear from Andreas, who's going to tell us more about the sorts of communities and economies that we need. Thank you.
So yeah, so I'll carry on and introduce the other three scales that we discuss in the manifesto. So after discussing alternative kinships, if you like, we move over to the scale of the community, and then to the scale of the economy, and finally to the scale of the world. And I'm going to very briefly introduce communities, then say a few more things about economies, not least because that's more closer to my discipline in a way, and then very few things about the world as well. Again, very briefly, however. Right, so starting with communities, right? How would caring communities look like? What we argue in the manifesto is that not all caring communities look or have to look the same. However, they have certain features that together create what might be called social infrastructures of care. They always, for example, involve shared resources, such as, for example, free public broadband, ubiquitous water fountains, and sharing not only books through public libraries, but things like kitchen hardware, garden tools, and toys. In other words, what is increasingly known as libraries of things. Caring communities always also involved shared space by creating more public and green space, cycle lanes, public transport, pedestrian and play streets, parks, and community centers. And finally, they facilitate shared activities. Such characteristics, for example, are embraced in newer forms of municipalism, what is known as radical municipalism, from Preston to Mississippi to Barcelona, and which are facilitating the rebirth of high streets, promoting co-ops and pushing for affordable housing, as well as offer models of what's sometimes called community wealth building and make international alliances. We may also think, of course, of the fabulous mutual aid neighborhood projects that have sprung up in the pandemic. So expanding the commons, or what we collectively own in terms of space, resources, and democratic engagement, is really key to the rough template for how we create caring communities and how we really take back controls from the forces of neoliberalism in a sustainable and pleasurable, as opposed to proto-fascistic and disaster capitalist form. So this is our core thesis as far as caring communities are concerned. And then we move to talk a bit about economies and try to address the question of how economies, caring economies, will look like. And one of the obvious things that we say there, especially in the diagnostic part of the manifesto, is that perhaps they could begin by involving more caring market actors. Therefore, we introduce the idea of care washing. That is briefly communication strategies designed to demonstrate how caring a corporation is in a way that often obscures that corporation's actual destructive social and environmental impacts. So during the first lockdown, for example, we had Amazon, among others, running a campaign across social media such as Instagram and Facebook, saying, and I'm quoting here, keeping our people safe while getting you the things you need has never been more important, end quote. At the same time, of course, we had Amazon being ordered, among others, to close its French factories on the basis of not respecting health and safety standards. So a bit of an irony there. Having said that, what we also make very clear in the main part of our manifesto is that a caring economy is not just about corporations. We need, in other words, to go beyond economies, to reimagine the economic as all that enables us to take care of each other. Put differently, economies do not just comprise markets, consumers, and producers, but also the material and immaterial care provisioned within our households, communities, states, and the world at large. So to what Lynne said earlier, social reproduction is not just something that the economy relies upon. Social reproduction is part of the economy. In that sense, the nature and scope of the economy has to be re-embedded within a society where care really is its organizing principle and universal care its underlying model. We follow the work of various alternative socialist and feminist economies, such as Nancy Folbrough, Ryan Eisler, Kate Raworth, Women's Budgets Group, to argue for a different economic vision, one that places all economic activity, from household to state provisioning, within a capacious understanding of society, and which is in turn understood as part of the ecology of the living world. We also join many of these authors, and I guess this is important for the discussion that we're having here, in asserting that care and capitalist market logics cannot be reconciled. There are many reasons why we are arguing that, but very briefly, first, there are few forms of intimate care work that are not best delivered with personal engagement and emotional attachment, qualities that cannot be quantified or reduced to market metrics. Second, markets can only allocate care responsibilities and services on the basis of buying power. Given current income inequalities, this is clearly not good for our model of universal care and socioeconomic justice. Third, market norms are notorious for crowding out non-market norms and values. Marketizing care foregrounds self-interest and instrumentality in every sphere of our caring lives. Think, for instance, of nanny who does anything the kids would with a view to increase the ratings on www.care.com. I don't know if you're familiar with this platform, but it's a platform basically where the gig economy meets the commoditized care economy. Or think of a medical doctor working in private practice who is keen to process as many patients as possible with a view to increase the daily targets. So where do we go from here? In the manifesto, we suggest, again very briefly, a two-pronged strategy. First, demarketize and decommodify all our care infrastructures. For example, we could begin by resocializing and insourcing as opposed to outsourcing our care commons and our community infrastructures that I just talked about. Or we could continue by bringing financial capital onshore as opposed to offshore, a point that Anne Pettifor, among others, have strongly made. But second, we have to ponder the question whether markets can ever be caring. And one thing to emphasize here is the distinction between the institution of the capitalist market and the actual markets as locations that we go to find various services and products. And talking about markets as locations, if you like, an obvious answer here is again no, if what we mean by that is local markets or digital markets driven by logics of capital accumulation. However, not all economic or marketplace activity is capitalist in that sense. We have to start building and recognizing already existing, more caring, equitable, and eco-socialist alternatives. Such alternatives can and do take many different forms: cooperatives, nationalization, progressive municipalism, localization, public commons partnerships. Through all these strategies and more, we need to ensure that consumers are reconnected with producers and care receivers are reconnected with caregivers. We have numerous examples here from a small structure in Athens that directly linked Zapatista producers with Greek consumers to the already scaled up solidarity economy structures of Spain, now accounting for roughly 10% of the country's GDP. The seeds of radical economic change, if you like, in that sense, are already here and embedded in local societies and communities where care already is their organizing principle. But talking about seeds of radical economic change, the last section of our manifesto focuses on caring for the world. Yeah? And as Lynne pointed out already, the pandemic has dramatically highlighted many of the essential functions that are crucial for our web of life and how to do so we have to avow our global interdependence. So very briefly, in the last part of our manifesto, we talk about the need to scale up our model of universal care to the global level by fostering transnational institutions, global networks, and alliances to implement, among others, a global Green New Deal, debt cancellation, financial re-regulation as opposed to deregulation, and porous borders, while embracing at the more subjectivity level, if you like, logics of democratic cosmopolitanism. So overall then, what we need is a global alliance of caring connections, as we put it, a widespread avowal of our interdependence in all of its ubiquitous complexities and challenges across different scales. And this is the main thesis of our manifesto. I will stop here, and I don't know if Sozita, you want us to take any questions now, or whether we are going to have a
Thank you. We can continue.
Okay.
We were also interested in learning how you collectively compose text in formally speaking and methodologically, because we are moving in to Vill Balaskas, who will talk about collaboration and how we can change institutions through collaboration. We usually talk about collaborative practice only in a non-institutional, in an institutional critique, but it's also very important to see the policy making behind collaboration. And I think Vill is unique to explain to us the procedures, because he's consulting Arts Council, and he's an artist based at Kingston University. Vill, hello.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Sozita and Eero, for organizing this. I will try to share my screen. Hopefully it's going to work, because I have a few slides prepared. So if you can give me a moment.
That you're director of research, business, and innovation. No, these three things are not conflicting for an artist, at the School of Art and Architecture at Kingston, London, and an advisor at Arts Council, England, in the field of collaborative research. Your artworks have been widely exhibited internationally in museums, festivals, and galleries, and you're co-author, and in that role we are interested mostly for this panel of contributor at the institution as Praxis, new curatorial directions for collaborative research, Sternberg Press. We look forward to hearing from you.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction, Sozita. Hopefully you can see my screen at the moment. If there's any issues, please let me know. I'm going to talk briefly about not my practice, but rather about my work, my advisory work as an academic around the Arts Council, and in particular my work at the Midlands Higher Education and Culture Forum by Arts Council England, which focuses on bringing together the cultural sector and higher education institutions in order to investigate how to better collaborate. And this is where caring and collaboration are coming together, really. So I'm going to start by providing you with a very short description of the background behind the work of the forum. And the forum was initiated in late 2017 in Nottingham, where I used to be based, as a network aiming to bring together and build partnerships between higher education and the cultural sector across the Midlands region. The Midlands region has around 20 universities, I should say, and multiple cultural institutions. Here, when we're talking about the cultural sector, we're talking about all types of institutions, really, from small artist-run spaces and community projects to major publicly funded institutions. So we had a launch conference in Nottingham with 150 stakeholders from both higher education and the cultural sector, where we investigated how we can identify common strategic challenges and opportunities. And as a result of that discussion, 5 working groups were created, as you can see in the slide here. And I was invited to co-chair the collaborative research working group in collaboration with my colleague Katerina, who used to be the head of research and public programs in Nottingham Contemporary, one of the major Kunsthalles of the UK. Now Katerina has moved to education. She's a professor in Coventry University. So through a series of events, like for instance, our conference in 2019, our second major conference called Mapping the Midlands, we aim to bring people together and start mapping, first of all, the region, discovering what each other is doing, what are the commonalities between what is happening, and what are the challenges that we have been facing. I should note here that the images that you see come from the Empire in Coventry, which is a live music venue. So quite an unconventional place to bring curators and artists who are not associated with this part of the creative arts sector. And this was in order to signify also, if you like, the importance of being very open in terms of how we approach all types of creative practices and all subsectors, if you like, within the within creative production. So what have been our main findings? First of all, I should say that both sectors identified the lack of time and resources as two major factors that hinder sector and intersector research and collaboration. And Lynne mentioned before that lack of time creates a care deficit, and that's very much the case with how higher education institutions are collaborating with the cultural sector. That's a major issue, especially in the case of smaller institutions, I should say, but it exists everywhere. Then secondly, we identified that there's a lack of common understanding of the terminology and structures of research employed in each sector. So that's a problem of language. Quite often we found that we were not using the same terms in order to describe very similar things, and that was an issue that had to be resolved and has to be resolved. And then finally, we identified a lack of access to knowledge exchange and collaborative initiatives, particularly for smaller cultural organizations, which had no prior connections with higher education institutions, no prior connections with different types of universities. So as a result of those findings and our consulting work and all the different dialogues we had, we initiated a series of outputs, which started with an online glossary to foster broader understanding of research terminology for both the cultural sector and higher education institutions. Then secondly, an online archive of regional case studies of successful collaborative research projects where people could see how different organizations are collaborating with each other and what could be perceived as good practice. We continued having a series of events on collaborative research, some of them being really focused, specific when it comes to their thematology, some others completely open. Conferences, closed seminars, workshops, study days, all types of events addressed to different types of organizations in order to be able to gain as much knowledge as possible. With Katerina, we co-wrote an advocacy document on collaborative research, which was addressed to Arts Council England and also to the research councils, based on all the findings and all the discussions that we've been having. And then finally, as a byproduct, if you like, of this process, we published a new book, an edited publication that featured accounts of different models of collaborative research and knowledge production within the cultural sector. That was published a few months ago, and I'm going to talk about the publication in more depth a bit later. So just a few examples of how the outputs have been functioning and what they look like. So this is a still from the glossary that we created. As you can see, there are quite a lot of acronyms, and in academia, we really like quite often to be using lots of acronyms that seem really difficult to to understand for people outside of academia, and we forget about that. And at the same time, there are certain organizations, certain structures in the cultural sector that people in academia ignore. So this has been a starting point in terms of finding out what types of organizations exist, what do acronyms mean, and what might be the channels through which we can bring together universities and artist-run spaces, museums, seek funding, and nurture a new ground for collaborating. In addition, we also had our case studies, as I mentioned. Here we have the case study beyond the Bauhaus, which is what we call in the UK academia collaborative doctoral awards. So this is a collaborative doctoral award between Nottingham Contemporary and Nottingham University, where a student, PhD student, is based at both institutions at the same time. This is a model that is not uncommon. However, what makes it a bit more meaningful and interesting is the fact that it's not based on the usual model where, as academics, we go to an institution and we mainly focus on things like their archive, because Nottingham Contemporary is not the kind of institution that has a collection. So this is one difference, and also the fact that it has much more of an international outlook, if you like, through also the collaboration with Haus der Kultur und der Welt. Another case study, which is slightly different, has to do with a fellowship, a 10-month fellowship, which again focuses on the action of mapping the landscape in a certain region, mapping all the different organizations, making sure, quite simply, that we know what is taking place in our doorstep. That's something that quite often we ignore. You know, we start a project and we start thinking really far away, or we have a maximalist, if you like, approach to things. This project does exactly that. It's thinking about how do you nurture an artist through your regional resources and knowledge. And now we'll briefly talk about a little bit about the publication, institution as Praxis, which is a publication that both builds on what happened in the context of the forum and my advisory work, our advisory work, but also it expands because there are, as you will see, contributions that go beyond this regional perspective, if you like. So first of all, our starting point has been the acknowledgement that universities are not the only sites where knowledge is produced. It might sound very simple as an acknowledgement, but it's a fact that higher education institutions are often ignoring. The cultural sector, artist-run spaces, galleries, larger institutions, they all have their own methodologies and ways of producing knowledge, which we have a lot to learn from. The second point to be made is a challenge, the challenge that academia is still in charge of determining the what's and hows of collaborative research projects, which itself is reliant on academic mechanisms of validation and predominantly based on the case study approach. So quite simply, we reach out to cultural institutions in order to study them, but with a very specific agenda that is already predetermined. So the collaboration is not happening, if you like, in equal terms. But there's also the reverse challenge. So increasingly, we see that cultural workers question the validation protocols of knowledge production in academia, which are based on the concepts of universal evidence, peer review, evaluation, and the supposed neutrality of the researcher. So our aim really has been to identify and advocate for a multiplicity of practices taking place in the cultural sector that do not only engage with a quest to deliver cultural activities like, for instance, exhibitions or events, the main things that cultural institutions are doing, but think beyond those and generate new modes of knowledge production and research in visual culture, art, and curatorial practices. So the book features accounts of research-led cultural organizations, also cultural programming in collaboration with higher education institutions, and then finally research-led curating. This is the front cover of the book and the contents. We have 15 contributions, 15 chapters. Out of those 15 chapters, 4 are by practitioners, researchers who are based in the Midlands or who used to be based in the Midlands. Another 6 are based in the rest of the UK, and then 5 that are international. And this has been a really important objective for us, to use our experience from the Midlands Higher Education and Culture Forum in order to see what is happening more widely. And that's why we invited people like Carolina Cerón from Colombia, and who work in Bogota, also Grupa, the curators of Documenta 15, who are based in Tunisia, and they have been working internationally with different types of methodologies. Obviously, academics from the UK and researchers from the UK, but also beyond, across Europe, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, it has been quite evident to us that it is important to gain a really strong knowledge on a local and regional level, and then gradually build and see what are the wider international connections that one could make in terms of collaborative methodologies that help us to build wider networks and a much better understanding of what each other is doing and how we can learn from each other. So finally, some key findings from the publication, at least from my point of view, what I see as some of those key findings. So first of all, I think both sectors displayed extraordinary resilience in the period that has followed the global financial crisis of 2008 and the Great Recession, which became catalysts for new collaborations and new collaborative methodologies. That has been a really important point, that despite the difficulties, there is appetite for collaboration, there is appetite for caring for each other. It's just a matter of finding the ways in which those things could be catalyzed. Then secondly, there has been an increased focus by cultural institutions on the production and dissemination of the commons through research projects whose reach and impact may be strengthened further by engaging in collaborative strategies. Thirdly, the challenges and opportunities for both sectors are often vertical and horizontal. So despite the fact that we have different types of universities, different types of higher education institutions, which can be teaching or research intensive, and different types of cultural institutions with or without collections, local, regional, national, with different models of funding, income generation, non-profit, artist-run, and so on and so forth. There are also important commonalities that are being ignored due to the lack of systematic dialogue and documentation. Furthermore, although practice-based research has an increasingly important role in universities, not all types of practice research and methodologies are viewed in equal terms or explored in full, and the transferability of practice methodologies remains low. So we still have a lot to learn as academic institutions from the way in which cultural workers are working on the ground, and what kind of solutions they're really finding in order to work with communities, in order to produce new knowledge. Then the irreversible changes that network communications have brought to knowledge production are also affecting the way in which institutional and formal knowledge production and dissemination are perceived by cultural workers, the public, and academics themselves. And then finally, there are multiple historical collaborative models which have been under-theorized, and quite often such initiatives were considered as being quite avant-garde at the time and can only now be appreciated thanks to increased connectivity as well as a renewed appetite for alternative formats of cultural praxis. This includes models stemming from regions that have been actually systematically ignored by the global north. So there are a lot of models that we can learn from, both current but also belonging to the past. So hopefully this gives you an overview of my advisory role and part of what the book that I have been talking about is covering. I have also included a few links at the end of the presentation if you'd like to find out more, for instance, about the way in which we have been working in the forum and see the case studies and the glossary, and also a few links about the book. And that's it for me. I'm going to try to stop sharing my screen and hopefully it's going to work. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. It was very fruitful. We will move on to a very special French festival in the periphery in Perpignan, FILAF Festival of Books and Film, that celebrated 10 years of existence. The festival takes place each year during the last week of June in the historic center of Perpignan. For 7 days, the international selection of books and films is freely available to the general public through screenings, presentations of books, and meetings with authors, filmmakers, and artists. This is a very caring caring festival in France, and we have Rachel Simon here and Sebastien Planas, who will be able to share with us their practice, their collaborative practice of institutional curating.
Hi.
Hello, Rachel.
Thank you for inviting us. We are happy to be.
Thank you for joining.
So you introduced us well. So we are a small but great festival based in south of France, and for more than 10 years now we organize a festival of books and films of art and also contemporary arts. And what I'm going to say,
Vous pouvez parler en français si c'est bien, je ne sais pas. But
No,
maybe we may have an English audience. We would focus on selected moments of collaboration in the festival, because we know how you invite artists, and often you give awards to American artists like Rob Storr and others. That's how we attended the festival. But also you focus a lot on younger artists, and you often organize collaborative projects between more prominent artists and up-and-coming artists. And perhaps you can share with us the methodology of how you select the artists and the year process of selecting the books and the films.
Well, actually, the main idea of the festival is something like a collaboration between fields that sometimes never meet together, just like films on art, archive or contemporary films on art, institutions like museum, art centers, booksellers or book producers, curators, and artists, living artists. And the main idea of the festival at the beginning was to mix people together, to see what happens when all those people that never meet do meet. And you've seen it, Sozita in Perpignan. It's quite a small festival but independent, and that's what you can call non-institutional festival, because we are not an institution. We are independent and real people with nothing to deal with money or nothing to deal with market, you know. And we are very lucky because from the beginning and until now, this kind of project has really made people come together, and such famous people, you said it, as Raymond who came here, it was incredible. And also very unknown artist or writer can live together during a week. And also during the last years, we had the will of making them produce something in Perpignan. That's why, yes. And you want to say a word about the producing of the...
So the festival aims to encourage collaboration between artists and authors and producers and institutional persons that are working in museum. And then during the festival, they collaborate together to produce like fanzine with just like Raymond do in 2019. And this year, for example, a photographer called Arnaud Pifka and Julien Carin come to FILAF and photograph people naked in famous places here in Perpignan. And then we edited it here and also said it then.
I can't hear you. On n'entend pas.
Oh, we can hear you.
We can't hear you.
The history of the festival is that it started as an initiative, a common initiative between, what is the history? It's 10 years ago. How did the festival...
Well, it was quite a crazy idea. At the end of a dinner in the summer, we had the idea of seeing that all the people around us. I was working in a museum with a French gallerist in Paris, and I had a friend of mine who were artists, just like Kadeb and Chama, for instance. And we said that the main point between us was we all had books about art, and we were crazy about books, and we would like to see more good films on art, which are really difficult to find, you know. And we said we will organize something like that in Perpignan, because Perpignan, you know, is a kind of French Riviera. It's in Catalonia. It's a very special place with a crazy history, and nobody knows where it is. We don't know if we are in France or in Spain or in Catalonia or whatever. And
for Occupy, because it's also about identity, occupying an embassy that has that's beyond national identities. And you are in between two great nations, and you were Spanish until recently.
Yeah, we were Spanish, we were Catalan. And, you know, it's the Mediterranean Sea. It depends on the scale you take. For me, we are actually now at the gallery of the festival, at the store, the small store we have in Perpignan, but it's very different for me to go 2 streets there, you know, because I grew up here, and every street has its history, its own history, just like in New York or Athens. I think it's everywhere the same. You make a few meters and it's different. And then you have a bigger scale between Perpignan and the towns around, and then you have another scale with the 100 kilometers around, and then another scale. So I think the idea of making local is a really good idea, but it's good when you mix local and universal. You know, Salvador Dali was living here. And it's a good example for us because you always live in Cadaqués, where just here. And all the people, Marcel Duchamp and all the surrealists and André Breton, and went there, and it was a kind of a crush between local and universal. Sometimes when you say local, it's like, you know, there's a universal and the local, but it's the same thing. It's a question of scale.
There were a lot of Parisian visitors at the festival. You received governmental funding, or you're completely independent?
Yes, we have some government funding. We have 25 different funding between local and national or American too. And but we are independent because no funding is beyond the 10% of the amount of the budget. You know, so if anybody, just like it's the case now in Perpignan, we have some election, and we have a kind of small Donald Trump that is the new mayor of Perpignan. It's really, you know, it's the husband of Marine Le Pen, you may know. It's really difficult for us. It's a real struggle, but if he doesn't give us any more money, we can go on without him and make it in Perpignan, because it's not his town, it's our town of the civil society, and we will go on and doing it. So this is our scale between local and universal and international bit. When French people coming from Paris come in Perpignan, it's really different for them, because, you know, in France, it's really central. It's between Paris and the rest of the country. En fait, la France, c'est Paris. When they come here, it's really good to make it in Perpignan, because it's not their field. It's not they're not anymore in Paris, so they can manage to do something else, and then not really with the same attitude. And that's why we like it, and we still do it like that.
Yeah. We will continue also with a French educated curator who was in Paris for many years, one of our most prominent curators, Katerina Koskina, who was also director of our Contemporary Art Museum in Athens, that has also fought with a lot of issues, governmental, and was also in the debate between local and global, always trying to open up the collection. And she curated the exhibition of Greek artists in Documenta, the last Documenta that was in dialogue between Kassel and Athens, Katerina Koskina, who has also worked with Kounelis, Yannis Kounelis, on a very impactful project and installation in the port of Piraeus called Ionion. Katerina?
Hello.
Hello,
good evening.
Hello, thank you for coming. You have, we all have a French connection here, and obviously you have been also with Anna Cafezzi for many years in Paris, where you were colleagues, and you both have been instrumental in creating the collection of EMST and the curatorial and museological studies for the new era of EMST, the Athenian Museum. That's also a museum that has functioned for many years without an actual home. Perhaps you would like to share with us your experiences about institutional collaboration, but also as an independent curator. And you're now working with the municipality of Athens.
Yeah. I am I serve as advisor to the mayor of Athens, advisor on culture to the mayor of Athens. This is something that is quite new, just a few months there. I'll tell you something, I do not wish to speak about EMST. I'm so much disappointed. So the people that know, and there are a lot of friends that I can see, understand why I prefer not to speak. Maybe I will write a book and I will ask your advice.
Yes, perhaps we can focus in the interesting collaborations and in the future as well. We are all eager to learn more about the famous project Ionion in Piraeus with the Kounelis, the site-specific project, because part of this project is the public sphere. And I know you were one of the first curators to have curated the project at the Metro of Athens, which is actually a public space. And it's not often acknowledged that this was one of the first public spaces in Athens, public art projects in Athens.
Sozita, it's true that I've been working since many years with in the public space, and now you are saying that, I'm also realizing it. To be honest, since because I've been invited 3 days ago, I was not very prepared. So thinking of some projects that I've been involved, I decided, although now that you are mentioning Kounelis, I am very touched, because this was really a very important project. And you know, I was very young, so I never realized the importance of that project. But what I want to tell is that, because this is a way to pay tribute to Kounelis, I was there, I learned a lot, and I think that since then, my point of view became larger. So I owe a lot to this project. And, but it is not Documenta, it is not the Ionian cargo vessel, it is the Biennale of Thessaloniki that I selected because of your title. So speaking about care, I thought that, and not only care, but also authorship and collaboration, I thought that my contribution to your panel will be more interesting if I speak about the Thessaloniki Biennale of Contemporary Art. Bill, I see you are very happy, and you, Vassilis. So I believe that this is an exam which took place many years ago. It started in 2007, but I served as the president of the Administrative Council and the director of Thessaloniki Biennale for 3 editions. I'm saying that because it is important to say that I had 6 years. 6 years is enough time to implement and to realize a vision, a dream, or whatever. So I was there for the 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition of the Thessaloniki Biennale. And I believe that this was an opportunity to, for institutions to come closer to communities, to urban landscapes, and to allow us, the organizers, to imagine alternative interactions with the urban fabric, the country, and the wider region of the Mediterranean. Because when we have started, it was just 2000, I mean, the preparation started in 2010. which was the year of the big turbulences, uprisings in Egypt, and then, you know, the whole Mediterranean almost was involved. So the goals, let's speak a bit about the goals. A major goal was the implementation of another important cultural event in the city. I say another one because, as most of you know, Thessaloniki is quite famous of being the organizer of the International Film and Documentary Festival. And this is really a very important festival in Greece, maybe one of the most important, together with the Epidaurus and Athens Festival for the theater. Then the idea was to try to create a new contemporary art pole in the southern East Europe, because Thessaloniki has really many advantages as a city. Then, for me, what was very important was the redefinition, sorry, I'm not an English speaker, I'm more French wise, redefinition of an identity. And when I mention identity, I do not speak only about the city. For me, the important thing were the citizens, and not citizens coming from Thessaloniki, but Greek citizens and Mediterranean citizens. The core of our attention during the Biennale was the Mediterranean region.
Because previously you were also involved in the Mediterranean Festival, also in Venice, with Adelina von Fistenberg as well.
No, I was not.
There was not a big forum, Maria Papadimitriou participated, a Mediterranean forum.
Yes, but I have just introduced the artist. I was not involved personally.
Okay.
I was involved through the Michelangelo Pistoletto, the cultural, cultural parliament for the Mediterranean, but not with Adelina. Adelina, we have cooperated for the Thessaloniki Biennale, for
the first.
No, for the fourth.
The fourth.
That was my favorite one. For the fourth. So let me just say very briefly the idea of the Biennale. I mean the three, from 2011 to 2015. The title was Old Intersections, Make It New, if you remember. 1, 2, 3. So that's why you are confused. It was the third, fourth, and fifth Biennale, but the 1, 2, 3 for the old intersection Make It New editions. So the theme was the Mediterranean Sea, as I said, as a geographical space in which the current cultural and social reality was researched and studied, although yet vague and still extremely interesting during to the constant changes, dramatic changes in the recent years, with its traditional elements, along with the influence and impact of the global model indicated. Now, how art and communities are placing themselves geographically is of extreme importance. As Greece then was really deep in the economic crisis, we believed that it was essential to speak about movement, fluidity, change as a gesture of understanding the changes that shape the present, as well as the histories that have brought us, but also the participating artists and the audience there in Thessaloniki. Moreover, the crisis was somehow forced and forced us into collaboration by accepting our fragility and the necessity of the other in order to produce and to give birth to various collaborative projects. So the title, I remind you, the title, I do not remember if I said it already, I think yes. It was Old Intersections, Make It New, and the idea was to try to reintroduce Greece as a country that played an important role in the past under a different aspect, and also try to admit that Greece is also part of this region, because very often we are looking to the Europe, the Europe wing of Mediterranean, and we forget all the other countries. And for me, this was very important, especially during this moment.
And Thessaloniki, I guess, as a center for the Balkan countries, and also using the Jewish past and the Islamic past, because part of making it new was to use the mosque, the mosques, all these landmark buildings, wasn't it?
Exactly. The idea was to transform the whole city in a public space. And this had to do with participation and engagement. So in reality, the Thessaloniki Biennale, if I have a few minutes, I will show you very quickly, a PowerPoint, which
yes, can see so that the audience understands.
I think that this will help you a lot. The idea was at that time, let me.
And you were always inviting other curators. You also had at least 5 curators that you worked with, like Katerina Gregos.
Yes, this was during the 3 years.
Yeah.
And,
so there was curatorial collaboration for, yeah.
The idea was to have always a guest curator or more for the a guest curator or more, because in the first year we kept the tradition of the 3 curators. So the curators were Paolo Colombo, Marina Fokidis, and Mahita Elbaha Urieta. Then for the second edition, I've been invited as, I have invited as guest curator Adelina von Fürstenberg. And for the 5th edition, the guest curator for the main exhibition was Katerina Gregos. But this was only for the main exhibition. The Biennale was a very big event, spread out in more than 15 buildings and in
also
spaces.
and it was a governmental, the difference between the Athenian biennial and Thessaloniki biennial, it was that it is a state biennial, and also the collection, the Kostakis collection is in Thessaloniki and many other museums. So I want to highlight this cultural importance of Thessaloniki.
That the biennial was not a governmental biennial in the sense that the government was not involved with the decision. The decision was made by the museum, the State Museum of Contemporary Art, which is a not-for-profit
a foundation,
νομικό πρόσωπο.
NGO.
It's not an NGO.
Like an NGO.
No. It's a νομικό πρόσωπο.
A public
institution.
Yeah.
A public institution, but the Biennale is just a decision of the then director, the first director. So and the whole city was participating, as I was saying, not only museums like the Archaeological Museum, the Byzantine Museum, the Teloglion Museum, monuments like the Turkish baths, the old Archaeological Museum, which is a beautiful building of the Ottoman period, and really squares, derelict houses in the center of Thessaloniki, and it was not just exhibitions. It was a performance festival. It was many educational programs, placing works at specific placements in the city, invitations for conferences, and I believe that we did really everything, cooperations with the film festival and other biennials in Europe, like the Biennale of Lyon at that time, and the Istanbul Biennial. So it was really a quite big thing, and the realization has been possible because on due time we have asked for, we made an application which allows us to have 3 million euros for the 3 editions, for the 3 years. It was 11, 13, and 15. What I would like to say is that because of this exhibition, we've been not only us, I mean the state at that time, museum and the cultural center belonging to the State Museum, but also the other 4 museums, 4 major museums of the city.
Momus.
Actually Momus, but at that time it was, Momus is only the state and the Macedonian, the former Macedonian. The other museums, the other 3 museums that participated were the Archaeological, the Byzantine, and the Teloglion.
And that was a decision of sustainability. Basically, you joined forces in order to have a more sustainable future for these museums.
Yes.
It was a big struggle, I remember.
Speaking of care, you know, what we did was to we try to achieve collectively, and I do not think that things can be achieved otherwise. The only way is by allowing the interaction of place, the citizens to come together and to create, to form different forms of collective and institutional practices.
And
So,
many women were involved, like with Makedoniko. It's the vision of women like Hoipel, then Tsatsanoglu, all your colleagues, Thuli Misiloglu. You were all women curators, most of you. Andreas Takis, whom we have at our board in Greece and USA, is the male legal voice behind Momus.
what you are mixing the years.
Yeah, but the history of the Salpistis has
Andreas was not there at that time. He came after I left in order to become the director of EMST, 2015. So I'm speaking, but anyway, what is important is that because of this organization, all the institutions and major monuments of Thessaloniki were able to participate, to change temporary, of course, the let's say the mission, since they open their doors in order to exhibit contemporary art along with the archaeological items, or the Byzantine items, etc. And I think that this is the reason I took that as a sample, is because I consider it as a anticipated sense of care. So I do not know if...
Now with this end note, we can invite Eero, Laine in the panel, where a professor, associate professor at University of Buffalo, State University of New York. We will then open up for questions. Thank you, Katerina, very much for the presentation. We will have a roundtable discussion with everyone. Eero, we have been writing, we're part of another collective, and we have been writing a book on care and collective authorship. It has been a great challenge for Minnesota University Press. We will apply for that, and it was during the pandemic, and it's a group of people who have been really trying to find a collective voice, and Eero will talk to us about collaborative practices in performance studies and in the arts. Eero?
Yes, thank you, Sozita.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. So it's a little odd for me to be presenting by myself on the topic of collaborative scholarship in theater and performance studies, but I'm glad that Sozita's here. Sozita's been quite involved here in many of the collective writing efforts that have come out of Performance Studies International in particular. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the collaborative processes that are currently underway, coming out of, again, Performance Studies International and a group called ENDS. But first, I do want to note that I'm struck somewhat by the title of this event itself, Unoccupy or Occupy, in part because I think a lot of the work, thinking all the way back to 2011 and 2012 around Occupy Wall Street and its various offshoots around the world, were part of a moment that opened quite a range of organizational and labor sharing possibilities. I think including many methodologies and decision-making mechanisms that seem to sit outside the academy and also maybe are directly oppositional to some of the hierarchical models of academic work. So I will say that some of that work in Occupy informs some of my involvement in various groups and performance studies that are working collectively and collaboratively and dispersed very widely across many time zones. So the 2020 Performance Studies International Conference, like many conferences this year, was postponed. There were some conversations among organizers whether we were going to cancel or postpone, and it was postponed. So like leaving that out on the horizon, with the looking towards a coronavirus-free world at some point, or perhaps at least a time when we can gather in the dozens or hundreds again. The conference itself was organized with the National Theater of Croatia in Rijeka, and the sort of format of the conference was to be organized along thematic streams. And one of those was ENDS, which was organized by myself, Christoph Van Barle, Kyoko Iwaki, Rhea Elzine, and Felipe Severa. So I'll just give you a little bit about what sort of the ethos of ENDS, and this was in the call for participants. So the collaboration of ENDS will extend beyond the local time of the PSI conference. The curators of the stream plan to devise practices of trans-individual writing that work across either physical or digital platforms to explore the processes of collective research and creation. And again, we wrote this before we knew that we would be quite literally dispersed and not meeting in person in Rijeka. We wrote, although the ends are upon us together, they're always delayed in the durational now, both in the world and in the theory we produce. ENDS proposes to take this ENDS as multiple, as an ontological overlap of finitudes, and to develop collective epistemes of the end. This conference stream will therefore experiment with distributed authorship and research as the methodology for the ends. What is the performance theory of our ends? And beyond, how might we push performance theories to consider the ends of performance beyond the potency of the ephemeral and the production of alternatives? What is performance theory as a means without ends? Ends will be a stream committed to collective writing, shared knowledge, and an intellectual commons. It's an attempt to reshape and overwrite notions of singular authorship and creation that remain pervasive in performance studies and affiliated disciplines, even as such ways of making often sit in opposition to the political and artistic work to which we aspire. And I think I can drop this in the chat, although I'm not sure if everyone can see it. This is the link to the stream, if you want to see that. So this this call, we received dozens of responses from around the world, as one does, and it was also released in parallel with a call for a joint issue between the journals Global Performance Studies, which is the Journal of Performance Studies International, and the Journal of Dramatic Theory and Criticism, which is based out of University of Kansas, and which I'm the editor. So in that call, if I can read a little bit more to you, artist collectives and collaborative labor frequently function at various points along the spectrum between shared autonomy and unwilling acquiescence. And yet in the arts, there is a persistent tendency to think in terms of genius and singular artistic voice. And so we should ask again, what even when our object of study is and has historically been collaborative in nature, why do we remain professionally obsessed with becoming singular voices? Considering the high level of collaboration necessary to produce theater and performance, why is so much of scholarship on this subject written by singular authors? And I think this, this roundtable is maybe pointing to some of the alternatives that we see to what is a very long tradition of single authored work in the academy and even in arts and the humanities. To what extent might theater and performance studies as a practice be benefited by some of the same conventions that inform the fundamental collaborative know-how of theater and performance making? How might collective forms of criticism, scholarship, and theory move us away from images of the individual genius and develop deeper conceptions of performance and theater practices as collaborative? That is, by developing collaborative scholarly practices, we might enable a different discourse on performance and theater. transforming the way we work, create, and critique while expanding our understanding of the broad network that we call performance. In a context where individual erudition and fierce competition for an ever-shrinking labor market are constitutive of the practice of studying performance, our collaborative methodologies an alternative and strategy for collective care and empowerment. So a lot of this work doesn't sit separately or emerge as some sort of isolated work that's only in Performance Studies International, as we know, from groups and other projects. To that call for papers, there were over 200 authors who responded to that. So this is obviously work that's underway right now. I mean, just to name a couple that are also affiliated with Performance Studies International, the After Performance Working Group has been developing a number of these methodologies over the years. And also the Future Advisory Board of Performance Studies International is a group of emerging scholars and artists that aim to diversify performance studies in parallel with work to build cohorts among the divergent field of performance studies. So I think that word cohort is one that I often come back to in thinking about collaborative work in and through performance studies, because it is somewhat intentionally broad with meanings that range from you know, a cohort of companions or associates, accomplice, to a group, a company. It has some military connotations, to also to be almost any group bound by similar statistical or demographic information. So ENDS, I think, is a cohort, the group ENDS, in that it is dispersed as members. We have members from Japan, New Zealand, Australia, the Philippines, Singapore, Belgium, France, Germany, Brazil, the US, and I think a few time zones in between there. And it does represent really Performance Studies International's dispersed membership. So to me, in part, like the terms say comrade or collective, cohort implies a boundedness that might be fairly specific or generic, but there is a certain determined facet to it. Similarly, the co-labor, which is built into collaboration, is one of maybe the most important aspects of the collective writing that's emerging through ENDS and some of the affiliate groups. We may grow to be friendly or even friends, but the basis of the relation is actually one of work and moving towards a common goal or an idea. So the cohort may grow together or apart, but it's still moving in a shared direction with work that's dispersed across authors. There's a smaller group of us within ENDS that were writing something over the summer and into the fall. And I think we used the line, we met at a canceled conference, because many of us just didn't know each other, but there was a sort of shared ethos of work that was possible because we were all performance studies scholars or performance makers. So this dispersal of authorship often obscures discrete contributions. There will be 6, 8, 12, or in the example that Sozita just mentioned, 16 authors writing a single book. And I think this is what separates much of the collective work that's emerging out of performance studies, aside from some of the science-based lab work. There isn't a first, second, third author format here. It's actually usually just alphabetical in terms of how authors are listed. So in the past year, the ENDS project has scaled some of this work up, so beyond clusters of 2, 3, or 4 people. With some members in ENDS have been meeting weekly, and a number of ongoing projects. There's the editing project, there's articles, there's book that's being written. And the outputs, I think in some ways, are secondary to the work of learning how to write together after, for many decades, for many of us, solitary writing. So many in the larger group of ENDS come to the project with artistic practices, and those same skills and modes of working often come into play on shared online documents with work developing through workshops, discrete tasks, and other activities that allow participants to begin to experiment with developing and working along shared texts. So just as a way of wrapping up here, like cohorts and like the dissolution of the singular author, which some of this work aspires to, like Occupy nearly a decade ago, the work that's currently emerging and emergent in and around Performance Studies International strains many of the assumptions about the academy and artistic and scholarly labor by virtue of its collectivity. But also, I think because of the ways that performance studies and the way that performance studies training structures an ethos of work and care. This is in many ways to say that collective scholarship and authorship in the arts and humanities isn't a technological problem or a question. Google Docs and Zoom are just tools. There will always be new tools, but we need to understand how to use them. So it's not a tech issue, it's a social issue. And I think there's an analogy here in the rehearsal room. A rehearsal studio is just an empty space or an empty room, but if you know how to use it, and if everyone walking into that room knows how to use it, or at least understands how it might be used, you can make some very interesting things. So that is the question of collectivity and collaboration in the arts and humanities is not necessarily how to build better tech or new platforms, but rather how to relearn how to work together, to care, and to build these collectives and institutions that can sustain such work and sustain each other.
We can't hear you, Sozita.
Thank you very much, Eero, for bringing all these notions that are very relevant to Occupy too, this collective process of finding new resonances for the term, new aesthetic and political resonances. We have been talking here. There have been many roundtables about art and politics and identity. And now one of the questions of the audience is about women. We can ask.
It's from Melanie, who was the moderator from the talk from 2 days ago, Melanie Levick-Parkin. In the 70s, Shayla Rowbotham, please excuse me if I'm not pronouncing this well, pointed out that women were often excluded from capitalist job markets as they were seen as unreliable workers because they would potentially always prioritize care work in the family or community at any given time. How do you think the punishment for prioritizing care work expresses itself in contemporary labor markets? So she's, and there is, okay, next one after, sorry. So that was for
Lynne.
The Care Collective and Bill. I think Lynne.
I think Lynne, yeah, has raised her hand.
I would also like to comment on all the talks, but will we get time to do that later?
Yes.
Okay, Sheila is a very good friend of mine, and I think that she was just describing the truth of that world in the 70s, where when she would get up to speak, either she would be heckled off stage because she was one of the very first women to be doing that, or she said it would be like a plane flying overhead, nobody would hear until she'd finished and some man could speak. So that sort of invalidation was so strong then. But interestingly, one of the very first things which Women's Liberation in Britain did was to organize the Night Cleaners campaign, where they had to work on so many levels, going into the buildings at night to work with the carers, cleaning those offices and so on. And one of them had invited Women's Liberation in, someone who'd been in the Communist Party, May Hobbs. So they did that. Then they had to go to the unions to try and get the unions to organize such workers, because care workers were never organized. And anyway, they had some success. But interestingly, 50 years later, that very same struggle goes on. The very same struggle goes on, that we now have a brand new union, the Universal Voices of the World, that Scott set up precisely to try and improve the appalling conditions of cleaners and care workers who are not unionized, who are in all those precarious jobs, working on 0 hours and so on and so forth. So, so it's certainly true that we have the same battle to keep fighting. I don't think that all feminists abandoned that struggle, but many were not engaged in it as they got involved in, you know, they come to feminism through the university or other places. And I think it's only more recently that feminists are coming back to think about care and carers. So again, one amazing thing about this moment is the way carers have been placed up front, although on the whole, we're only paying lip service to clapping them or saying how important they are. They're not getting any increase in wages and they're not getting any better treatment. So there's still way to go and all the old battles still to fight.
Can I just add to Lynne's point? So yes, on the one hand, of course, yes, care work remains undervalued, underpaid for a variety of different reasons that Lynne explained. But when it comes to the question, actually, it gets a bit more complicated than that, I would think. Because partly, I mean, I'm a marketing academic, for example, and when it comes to contemporary labor markets, I know that marketing, for example, as a profession is often described as feminized. So there are particular kinds of marketing work that are seen to have understood as feminine qualities and therefore more suitable for women. But as previous research has shown, these certain work posts, for example, there's a glass ceiling to them. You know, you can only do so much within the organization and you are only allowed to behave in specific ways. So this is yet another way in which, you know, prioritizing care work is expressed in contemporary labor markets. It's not just marketing. There are many other service-oriented industries that look for these feminine qualities, if you like. But also there's yet another one, which is more profound, actually, and affects us all, which is what Nancy Folbrook describes as the invisible heart of the market versus the invisible hand. And basically qualities like caring for one's colleagues or genuinely caring for a customer even, you know, are not necessarily valued by the market because insofar as they cannot be quantified or instrumentalized, they're outside the market logic. So if, let's say, you're in the workplace and actually you care more for your colleagues than you should, you are doing this at the expense of what the market values, which may be, for example, another publication, another exhibition, another something quantifiable that you can show and go for promotion. So in that sense, caring within the workplace is also punished via, you know, undermining, you know, someone's place in the organization too. So I think the conflict between the market logic and the care logic is reflected in that sense as well, in terms of what we prioritize when we find ourselves in workspaces. Yeah.
And Bill?
If I may add something from the point of view of academia, I would say that the conflict that Andreas has been describing is absolutely at the core of the conditions that we are currently experiencing. I mean, it has been only intensifying ever since the crisis of 2008. The precarity of academic work and research has been only increasing, especially so for women academics, I should say. The glass ceiling is absolutely there. There are steps taken in order to confront that, but at the same time, there are those factors, if you like, that are presented as external and thus as supposedly neutral or natural, like, for instance, the crisis or the pandemic, that then are being used as excuses in order to create new types of barriers to you know, fighting this punishment methods of contemporary labor markets. So I think we are at a moment when those old threats, or supposedly old threats, are intensifying once again, and we might find ourselves in a position of experiencing very unpleasant surprises, if you like, in terms of taking a lot of steps back. And talking from the point of the UK academia and the labor market, we can see those things arriving actually sooner rather than later.
And perhaps you would like to expand on the policy making aspects, Bill, and your residency in Australia.
Sure, yeah. So the policy making part and trying to influence policy making, that's what we have been doing through the advocacy work, has been a bit about what I think Andreas described earlier as insourcing instead of outsourcing. So it's about looking at what kind of caring networks and methodologies really we can share and employ in order to be able to be more resilient to those external pressures, and the fact that quite simply culture and education are not a priority for policymakers. It's as simple as that. In terms of how this connects with my work in Australia, I have been working in Australia for the last 5 to 6 years as an artist, and now in the next year I have been invited by the Australian National University to do in a way a similar exercise to the one we did in the Midlands region in the UK, in order to help colleagues there map the collaborative collaborative research structures and methodologies that exist, which are extremely interesting because there you also have another layer, which is how Aboriginal communities are being treated and what kind of roles Aboriginal arts centers have in their cultural landscape. It's quite a unique situation, so I'm really looking forward to learning a lot more about this. And I think there, as I said in my presentation, there are a lot of things that we can learn from places that we wouldn't initially imagine, both places that exist in our doorsteps, but also places that have been marginalized both geographically and also in social and cultural terms.
And given that we are also focusing on artistic practice, we would like to invite Vassilis Salpistis, an Occupy project artist who is based in Paris, to discuss a bit on the double agent identity or the hybrid role of the artist between Greece and France, and the different notions of occupying a real or imaginary space.
Yes, I'd like to come back to different elements from the discussion. What kind of surfaces is the question of the intersection in the thought of care, first of all, the intersectionality in the intersection that Katerina talked about, but also in artist research. And I would like to propose a more critical view of this question in the implementation of all this in our work as an artist and as an art teacher. First of all, in the academic part, in the art, because I taught in an art school in France, and we had the third cycle and the research program in the continuity of the Bologna agreements, just like everyone else in France. We have now new research programs, and this is a real intersection crashing failure in a sense, because this school has research programs for the teachers, research programs for the undergraduate students, and invited artists that are also researchers. All these different groups of people have to, through the year, learn to kind of know each other, try to work with each other, and then produce, of course, some kind of token work that will show our financiers that the research work has been done and they have been paying money for something. All this work transforms the research process in a research representation, and no real work is done because it's just too much, the overlapping of all these different programs and the time that it takes to meet all these people transforms the work to a representation of work. Whereas in the more pirate situations, real research can be done in the school, but this is not in the representation. It's just, and this brings us to Occupy, which is what kind of happened here. We have met before this idea. Of course, we are in Occupy 2, and there was an Occupy 1, which was like a real exhibition situation. Artists met, they made an exhibition proposition, the exhibition was done, and that was it. We were brought together, and then the pandemic happened. So we were left with our questions, and we were like put in a research situation. So we were a de facto research group. We became a research group through the situation, and so we can be hopeful that this can bring better results than if it was just the product of an institutional will. And the question of the intersection, the possibility of the intersectional critique is also in the way the care question is going to be implemented in countries like Greece and France, which are actually experiencing a shift from a public art model to a more and more privatized and more and more like Anglo-Saxonic model. We are in both countries, we are experiencing this, because when we see this from an Anglo-Saxonic perspective, we know where people stand, we know where institutions stand, which is not so much the case. For instance, in France, we are really shifting. And so, like mixed models like Le Palais de Tokyo, for example, has in its function very, very different levels of private presence, financing, scholarships, but different levels. So when we have this kind of issues that are going to be treated by curators and artists in this shifting context, we have to be very, very careful and cautious to create first of all, create the grouping for the curators and the artists, so as not to be just simple care washing agents, because this is what is going to happen. I mean, it is the way these different structures, moving structures, meet at this point is going to inevitably produce this kind of effect. So we have to imagine a way to bring together and empower, in a sense, these agents, so as not to be simple puppets, in a sense, of a system. I say this because this thing happens in France, and because it's a very slow shift. It's a shift that it's a moving landscape, and a very slowly moving landscape. So we have to be cautious. I think in Greece there is more critical thought, because this process has been very much accelerated in Greece through the crisis. So the role of the private institutions and their emergence has been a bit more consciously thought of, but it's not the case in France, and still it's in both cases it's moving landscapes. So we have to find our place, and we have to find our agency, I think, both artists and curators in this moving landscapes. I don't know if that was the question. That was what I thought from what you said.
Art unexpected.
Vassilis, sorry. Can I say, Sozita, can I ask something?
You're asking me.
No, because I think Vassilis thinks he's going to get away without explaining his version of Occupy, which goes to Eero Laine, right? So he said, oh, it's funny, we have Occupy, and it's like 9 years later. But Vassilis has an answer to that, and I won't let him go without saying it, which is your answer, right? Not mine.
No, 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 it's no, it's the question of we were talking about this. We were talking, and this is also a very important question. How do we treat these things? What is great about Occupy is that it's a useless term. It's not a fashionable term. So this allows us to invest it in a new way. That's what I was talking about when I was talking about the fact that we were put in a research situation. This was both in the actual context of the pandemic, that it didn't allow us to just show our works, make a proposition, show the works, drink the bad wine and go home. We were forced to work together and think together, but also in the not unhistorical, but in actual context of the Occupy. We had to face the Occupy problem. This was not a fashionable word. So what do we do? What is that made us think? What is the time frame of treating such phenomena? Because what happened is we realized in our discussions that this term was certainly linked to a very specific moment in the United States, but the socio-political context in which this moment enters is still evolving. It involves the Nuit debout in France, it involves Gilets jaunes, it involves the emergence of Syriza, and it involves all the public places in Western countries. It may be Spain, Italy, Greece, the United States. So it's a larger question that is evolving. It is not fashionable, but we're living it. So we are kind of occupying this unfashionable context in this research situation in which we found ourselves in.
I think Eero didn't, his comment wasn't, maybe perhaps you can explain, Eero, if you can expand on your comment.
Sure. I mean, Occupy even now, sometime later, is tied up with Occupy and Occupy Wall Street and all of that, of course. But I think it was interesting that this is, I know that your project is larger than this discussion on collaboration and collective creation, but I do see quite a few connections that came out of that Occupy movement and moment. People are leaving. In terms of the organizational structures of Occupy, in the sense that it was broadly leaderless. It was both like the organizing structure was general assemblies, breakout groups, clusters, cells even, and I do see some of that logic in many of the groups and organizations you just mentioned, of course, and then also it is a kind of methodology that I'm seeing and experiencing and working with at least in the broad field of performance studies, in terms of how academic, scholarly, and artistic work is created, with people finding affiliation in different ways, cohorts of people working together, et cetera. It's not an institutionally driven project always, but rather it seems extra institutional in the way that just putting Occupy this project made me think of 10 years ago because of these shared methodologies.
Thank you so much.
And I think Lynne wanted to make some remarks, some concluding remarks.
I'd like to, because I have to go, if that's all right. Okay, I wanted to talk about what everybody said, but some people have gone anyway, so I won't do that. I hope to get to the festival in France, and it was interesting to hear Katerina talk about the role of public art projects, but relating it back to what we've just been discussing, I think that it's not just that most artistic productions are individualistic, they're narcissistically so. They're almost, by definition, individualistic, aren't they? You know, leaving it by artistic creation. And so there's always a struggle, you know, to put politics there. And inside institutions, there's a particular struggle. Like when I was listening to Vill about, you know, collectivity in the universities, I was thinking, yes, they pay so much lip service to working together and collaboration, but they have no interest really. Nobody gets promoted because of that. They get promoted because of their individual work, or because they're seen as the leader who brought in the funding or who allows the collective work to be done. That just being engaged in it won't help you individually at all. So it's always a political project. And as a political project, I think that all the things that Eero and Vassilis have been saying are just crucial, because it's very hard to keep that alive. You know, in the high points of struggle, there is always art production. There is always what helps keep it alive. There's a wonderful piece written by Michael Tausig on going down, doing his ethnomethodology, you know, his ethnography in Occupy in New York. And he wrote it called, "I Was So Angry, I Made a Sign," you know, and so many people were doing their artwork for the moment because they've never been listened to before. You know, it's crucial in holding them together, in keeping it going. But, you know, that can just disappear overnight once the police move in and the batons are there and so on. And so, you know, then you create your alternative art practices, which are very important and actually been crucially important around care. I mean, there's a lot of women doing art caring practices, and we've spoken with them, and they've been some of the most exciting people we've spoken with. But, you know, we have to see how very hard it is. I mean, I think my whole career comes from collective working together, existing at all, really coming from that. But I said I knew Sheila Rowbottom. It was Sheila Rowbottom who got me to write my very first article in Beyond the Fragment. She said, "I'll give a talk in your socialist centre on you know, what's wrong with Leninist organizing, if you'll say something about doing that locally." And so I did. And so then my writing career began. And then it did take off. And of course, I only survived and got promoted in my jobs through my individual production. But what's been good in the care collective is to come back to where I began. Or of course, I've just retired though, so I don't have to keep on achieving individually. And, you know, we all know, those of us in the care collective, that it can be quite hard work. You know, people feel criticized, they feel left out. There's always going to be the tyranny of structures that certain people will seem more important. So it's not easy, but it is crucial. You know, it's really crucial that we do try to hang together and work together and know how hard it is. Just like I said, we need to know how hard caring is. You know, there can be hostility and resentment, and there will be that. There will be that in our caring work. There will be see other people dominating and taking up too much space. And, you know, all we can do is then find counter moves to share, to try and support each other and hold people together. Use Winnicott, someone mentioned Winnicott somewhere, I think, to create those holding spaces that enables us to stay together. So, you know, it really is difficult, crucial, but difficult, and never more crucial than now, although never more possible than now. I think that care for each other and care for the world is so much to the fore. So let's see what we can keep building on it. And it's been wonderful to be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynne. And you have been in many collectives over the years, we guess. Thank you. Is there any more Are there any more questions from or contributions? Irini, thank you for inviting us all, and thank you for a great panel. The Care Collective, Vill, Balaskas, Eero, Laine, Katerina, Koskina, Rachel Simon, and Sebastien Planas from FILAF Festival. I hope you can visit the various sites and links, and we hope to have you at our next panels and presentations.
Our next panel, can I just say 1 second?
Oh,
but our next panel, let's not forget them, because we always do that at the end. It takes 1 minute. So our next panel is next Monday. It's Medea Electronique, who are Angeliki Poulou and Manolis Manousakis, with Estelle Baudou, Cédric Emenier, Julien Gardère, and Athina Ioannou. And the discussion is called The Artist Between Shaman and Laborer, A Matter of Gaze. So I think it's very, it was a big discussion at the beginning of our project, and I look forward to that. Thank you so much for being with us.
Everybody,
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting.
See you all again. I hope to see you all again, even in the flesh. How wonderful that would be.
Oh my God. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.